welcome to another episode of The Packet Party with me, Vlad, and my co-host Fred. Today's episode is a special one. It's part of a two-part series with Scott Williamson from ThousandEyes. In part one today, we're discussing what digital experience monitoring is and ultimately, why should you actually care about it? Now, let's roll straight into the show. All right, and today we have our dear friend Scott with us today. Scott, can you give us an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, so Scott Williamson, I'm a solutions engineer focused on on ThousandEyes inside the greater machine. So focused 100% on digital experience monitoring inside there.
Fantastic. So today we are going to be discussing digital experience monitoring, what that is, and right at the end, most importantly, why should we care about it? But I guess to kick things off, where do we start?
All right. Yeah. So this topic actually really just came about when we were talking about, IT in general. And, as this podcast is all about IT related stuff, technology related stuff, one thing that really caught our eye was this whole concept of digital experience. And, the way I describe it is, why should user experience be of a huge importance? Like, people nowadays, it's very rare for you to find people who aren't aware of the internet, who hasn't used any kind of online service. Those are far and few in between. And if you ask anyone, most of the kids nowadays really do care about, speed, everything at the click of it, at the instance of a click. And and I'm not speaking for Scotty here, he's slightly ahead of me by a few years. But when I started out, people really cared. When people got onto the internet, all they really cared about was getting information from wherever it may be hosted or wherever it may be accessible. So you have to sit in front of a computer, and then you switch on your modem, you go through that whole jig, and voila, you suddenly can open a web page that's sitting in the US or download music off of somewhere. And you don't really care because one music at about 5 meg, you download it for about an hour, and then you're happy at the end of it. How things have changed over those years. And now if suddenly Netflix doesn't load for about 10 seconds, you'll hear probably a kid freaking out in the background. So how things have changed, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Those were the days, right, of the 28, 46, 56K, 52K modems and the beep boop. And you'd have, what were those things, where you could pause your download. You could then reconnect your internet after 4 hours and then resume your download as well, right? And now it's like, if my download doesn't start in 5 seconds, I'm like, refresh, hit the F5 key, smashing away at it, right? It's
downloading it 50 times, yeah.
I want to hear it from Scott experience, though.
Yeah, well, I guess back then compared to now, the digital experience was very poor. That it was good enough, and that's the difference now is that, we have companies that, put in a lot of infrastructure, spend a lot of money on infrastructure and bandwidth and links. And they might even have, a gigabit internet link, and then they upgrade it to 5 gig or 10 gig, and yet the user experience is the same because they've reached other saturation points. Now, what's causing that problem, So I guess that's where the digital experience comes in, is like being able to baseline and understand what the average user experience is. And then if you make changes, how do you measure that over time? Does this investment in, changing all this infrastructure make any difference to digital experience or not? You get to a point of saturation, I suppose. And while it's relevant, to customers, it's relevant in a lot of different ways. Like there's so many use cases. Like I sit there in customer meetings, and customers tell me your problems, and they start to cry at some stage during that about all the issues they have. Internal, external. What some cloud services doing today. Different use cases relevant to different customers. We sort of bring them down sort of internal terminology where we have like what we call the customer digital experience, which is what people that are, really customers of me, external people accessing my systems, what's their experience. And then, employee digital experience would be the other one, where it's like not just them inside accessing applications, but them outside VPNing in or connecting in via, these new fancy security mechanisms where you don't have to VPN in. Like we're quite familiar with, what's the user experience. If you look at internally in our company, not to throw mud, but, our digital experience on applications is quite good. But, our single sign-on experience with 4,000 redirects is very poor. So therefore, overall, it's a very poor digital experience, even though everything works really well. So how do I measure that and know about each step that's taking to work out what's causing that problem? Is it DNS resolution times? Is it proxy servers? Is it the VPN? Is it the way my traffic's been redirected around the internet? Is it something? What is that? Which node in this, or which problems? Normally, big customer issues. I'll probably talk about this more too. Is big customer problems, and they talk to us. There's normally like multiple issues causing that problem. On average, it's probably like 3 or 4. Believe it or not, but not the issues you thought it was to start with, because the network's always slow.
Right. Yep.
What's going on? Yeah.
And being traditional network, being traditional network engineers ourselves, Vlad, it's always been blamed on the network if, say, an application or a UI that's some kind of service running inside or outside of the company, they always end up blaming the network for, say, hey, there's a slowdown in accessing this application or whatever it is. Why is it that people always think that it's the network that's at fault?
I mean, it's the easiest thing to blame, right? You blame the pipes that the poop is draining down, right? They must be clogged. They must be. And then in reverse, right, you go on places like Reddit and you see how famous it is now that it wasn't the network, it was DNS. That whole conversation, it kind of reminded me of just how multi-layered it is, right? And how very siloed sometimes the view is within businesses too. How, as a network engineer, I look at the network, the application looks at the application, the server guys look at the servers. And it reminds me of, like, if you think about a retail store, right? I've got my POS unit. And if I cannot do my pay wave and tap to pay, and that doesn't go through, then, I have to back out to cash, right? And we've all seen what happens in retail stores when the network goes down. Suddenly they have to go back to like printing credit cards through these machines to then, process those transactions like the following day somewhere else off site. It's absolute madness. But then sometimes maybe the network is up, right? But then perhaps like the API to Visa's processing unit is down. That was actually massive news probably, 2 years ago, I think it was. So it's just, lives have become so integrated into technology, but it's become so multifaceted that like there is any step where something could go wrong. But ultimately, the first place that always gets blamed is unfortunately the network. Is it the pipes between all of these different connections that's the problem? Yeah,
definitely. And I think there's two things there. One is when we hear as network engineers, it's the network's fault. First of all, we go, no, it's not. But we think as a network as in switches and routers and that kind of stuff. Whereas the average user would think of that as, the internet's just the network. But as you talked about, behind that is what isn't behind that. For me to access that from a corporate environment or something, for example, is obviously going to be DNS, proxies, firewalls. Then I'm accessing over internet BGP, routing, multiple links, multipathing. Then you're getting into the back-end application, load balancers, again, firewalls, load balancers. Where in the geo is it going to end up based on my geolocation right now, my IP address? The internet's not very good at knowing that. Where am I going to end up, in Sydney or Singapore or somewhere else? Especially when Starlink or something first came out, is that no one in Australia really watched Netflix properly or anything like that because we're all geolocated out of Australia. They fixed a lot of that now, but it's quite important, that path to the application and that user's journey, and then when that goes wrong, like, how do you know which box to look at? Like, you can, as network engineers, we used to pat ourselves on the back, and we'd go all the way through that, triage all that, finally prove that, maybe even the user didn't get an IP address, so a DHCP server. And then we go to the server guys and give them a flogging because, they should have picked it up first rather than the network guy picking that up, if the network guy wasn't responsible for DHCP. So, and being able to drill that down really, really quickly rather than hours and days of triaging is key.
Yeah, the BGP is particularly notorious, or AKA the bridging gap protocol.
Normally it's the people that configure it that is the problem.
I don't know if you picked up on that one, but that was the error in labeling or deciphering the BGP acronym in one of the news outlets.
Oh, you do. In our industry, we see a lot of acronyms used incorrectly, don't we?
That's probably a whole show in itself.
What does this acronym stand for? There'll be like 50 versions of it.
In your opinion, though, Scotty, does it, like, even for the common layman, the common user, does it help at all in some ways to understand at least that the internet is not just a network, it's a whole combination of a lot of different things? Like, we're not encouraging them to go down to the level of understanding what DNS is or what DHCP is, but at least understand that there's a few dependencies that kind of make this whole thing work. What are your thoughts around that?
I don't think we're ever going to educate the average user about that, but I think that's what it's like when, as network engineers, when clouds first came around and they come and talk to us, it's like, oh, that just happens in the cloud. It's like, yeah, but how's the cloud hung together? We care, but the average person doesn't care. It's the cloud, it's the internet, it's the network. I guess as network engineers, you go, yeah, okay, it's the network, and let me go off and, not care about my parts of it, my switches and routers and stuff like that, and just sort of show pretty quickly, that it is whatever it is causing that problem. I don't reckon you could ever win that.
Yeah.
Trying to re-educate.
I was going to say, I remember when YouTube got BGP hijacked by, what was it, Iran or something, and then YouTube went down because they just couldn't handle the flood of traffic, and people didn't care, right? It was like, I don't care that someone hijacked some whatever. I just care the fact that I can't actually access that service.
Yeah. And it's not even their fault half the time. Like, the way BGP works, apart from, making sure the paths are assured, incorrect configuration or even correct configuration can cause routing to go via whole other countries where they can then sniff that packets going past. It's getting a little bit harder to do, but it's still there. And DNS is the same with, DNSSEC and things like that. Like, and those sort of things are important to the digital experience as well. Like, we don't really talk about security use cases, but there are a lot, about, why is that going via that path? Whereas you wouldn't know unless you, even in a trace route, you mightn't even see that. We're having that path visualization, being able to see that end to end is quite important.
Yeah. So I think we've definitely covered, I guess, the shift and the demand for these technologies. The internet is an unpredictable place, and naturally we need to have some way to monitor it, or monitor at least the experience of utilizing applications that sit on top of all of that. Scott, in your mind, I guess, tell us, what are those components that are critical then to a good digital experiencing monitoring deployment? Like, where should we start? What should we look at? What are the basics where should we start, I guess you should say?
Yeah, I've written a little bit of documentation on this because it is like, I think to every person it'd be slightly defined differently, but it really starts off, especially with like we can monitor everything and do that kind of stuff if price wasn't a barrier. That's fine. It's like anything, but when it is, it's then down to what's important to an organisation. What has the highest revenue loss, for example, or the revenue generating applications, or productivity losses. Like, if a certain video conferencing platform was to go down, not only does it have reputational damage for that company that has that platform, but it also has lost time for the people using it. So how do I do, and it could be anything that's at fault. So how do I reduce that lost time, downtime? How do I decreased my mean time to repair, inside there is probably the most sort of important thing. Got something else in my head about that, but it's gone now. So that makes sense. So that's where I'd start. So that's where I'd start, talking to the customer, detailing what's their top applications, what matters to the business. Because some customers, it's like, well, if my collaboration platform's down, then we just use mobile phones. We don't care. We just use FaceTime. We don't really care. We use WhatsApp. We fall back to that. Other companies, it's like, no, they have to use that. If it's down, then we can't function as a business, I guess. It's probably focusing on those and bringing that inside there.
Got it. So, I mean, if we're talking about a good deployment of a technology, I guess you have to first start at the basics. What are my use cases? What do I actually want to monitor? Am I monitoring my employees and their experience? Am I monitoring the experience of what people outside of my company have in regards to something that may be a service I deliver on the internet then? That makes sense. I guess.
Yeah. And I was thinking, since we were kind of breaking apart these components that put together, that come together to present the internet as we know it, I realized that there are different ways that we can monitor them. And as Scotty said, if cost is not a barrier, we could probably put together that works and looks at the whole thing end to end. But then, you have different components to consider, like, are we looking at just the application and the response time, the server, and all that stuff, or do we care more about the network performance or something else along that path? And really, part of that consideration would be which one do you prioritize more, and which one is probably more critical to your business.
Yep, 100%.
So, if we were to then take the idea of, let's say, employee monitoring. These days, everyone is hybrid working, even with return to office mandates, right? You still have people working from a cafe or from home at least some part of the day of the week. And how do we then start, or how should someone start in terms of looking at what they can do to, I guess, try and understand, is my WebEx meeting from home as good as the experience I'm having in office? Or my sync times to download something from OneDrive, is that better at home or at work? Where would I start from there?
Yeah, so we call that end point monitoring, or end user monitoring, I suppose. So it's typically an agent deployed on the person's machine that does multiple things, and this is where all vendors slowly get different inside there. Some agnostic, some are included in their platforms. For that. Really in there's a conjunction of things that need to be done. One is like your standard, what we call synthetic monitoring, like testing to something all the time and testing that experience, and that's going to pick up things that it's still back to proving something innocent. We do a lot more of proving innocent than guilty, because a user at home can have a complaint, this isn't working. And probably the bigger use cases here are, the higher paid executives, because they're going to scream the loudest, and contact centers, because a lot of places, like we experience in the company we all work in, is that, you only got 40, 50 desks in an office and 100 plus people working out of there. So contact centers are the same. They reduce their footprint. So they work from home, but you don't have control over their Wi-Fi, over their home network, that kind of stuff. So you've got to be able to do synthetic monitoring to say, is this going to work when this person wakes up and starts logging in to do stuff? Is everything, and if it's not, what's wrong? Is it their Wi-Fi? Is it the home router? Is it actually their ISP got issues? All that innocent stuff. DNS again, obviously, we'll bring that one back up. So always bring that one up. Cloud security products, all those sort of things. Then there's some level of dynamic testing. So I'm on a call, whether it be WebEx, Teams, Zoom, don't really care. I'm on that call. At that point in time, I can be connected to anything dynamically around the world, because the way cloud work is, my call from Brisbane, where I'm located, could be end up in Sydney or Melbourne or Singapore or Japan even, and even far to other countries. Like, hey, I'm having a poor experience. Oh, why is your call terminated in Japan? It's like, oh, don't know. I just made a call, and it's having that dynamic data so we can find the endpoints and do that straight away in there. The other bit in endpoint agent sort of monitoring is around the browser interception. So a user's using their application in their browser. It's like, what's their experience? We're not interested in collecting. Typically, systems aren't interested in collecting privacy-related data. You probably don't want that in your platform because then your questionnaires get longer. So, so doing that as well. So you've got real-time data from the browser. You've got dynamic data based on what the user's doing, and then that background synthetic test data, which is just doing that test 24/7 while the machine's got power. So that's sort of the mix inside there, but all comes down to the age of the machine that's going to pick up Wi-Fi, CPU, memory, processors running, other things as well. Because 100% CPU on your laptop is going to cause issues, as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that makes sense. Long-winded answer, sorry.
No, it's a good thing too, and you kind of touched on the topic of privacy, which is probably a very touchy subject for a lot of people the world over. And I guess if I'm hearing it correctly, what you're saying is your vendor, there's really no stopping your vendor from being able to collect all that data, even the privacy related and personally identifiable information. However, of course, you'll be going with a trustworthy brand, with a reliable name that you can trust to keep them honest and not be collecting those data which they shouldn't be. And I guess you have, is there a responsibility from the user side or the buyer to kind of make sure that these products are honest in the way they're doing or collecting that data?
100%. Like, all of that can be disabled in any reputable platform. And then also in parts of the world, there's GDPR compliance.
Mm-hmm.
So your platform has to be able to have the right to be forgotten, and also potentially not collecting that data as well. There can be some issues in that, though. If you're not collecting that data, how do you know about the user experience?
Correct.
But not storing that. So like, hey, when we're looking at browser interception or picking up browser statistics as what the user's doing, is we don't care about what's inside the HTML. We don't care about the credit card being entered. That's not even collected. You wouldn't ever collect that. So unfortunately, like, some of the stuff around PII is things like MAC addresses and IP addresses. People think of PII, but anyone can have a 10 address. Anyone can change their MAC address. So they're not really truly PII. Username, maybe you're starting to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to be able to turn that off and on, or potentially what's the benefit versus the risk, I suppose, and does it outweigh it? But PII is certainly a big discussion, especially now with AI and LLMs and things like that. It's probably, I think we're yet to even start scratching that. Straightaway response we've seen around that with some customers, especially federal type customers, is turn off any AI for our platform, please. It's like, but that's the cool fancy stuff. What are you going to
That's half the reason you're actually buying.
But I get why they want it, because data leakage. I don't really know. You're using a third party potentially, maybe not. You can kind of understand why. Like, head in the sand's easier than trying to work it all out.
Absolutely. So tying that back to businesses that are being run or dependent on IT resources and IT technology as a whole, how have you seen businesses respond to this sort of, I would call it, shift in perspective in technology consumption? Would it be something that's prudent for, if majority, if not all of our customers who rely on technology, the internet and IT, to have some level of performance monitoring, be it application, network, or a combination of both?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there that come to mind. Hopefully I remember them as I cover them, but one of them is some businesses kind of just aren't ready for that change. Like, first of all, digital experience monitoring, comes at a cost. So cost benefit analysis, business cases, all that kind of stuff need to be done. You're not going to go and monitor something simple, and you accidentally end up monitoring stuff as well. If you're doing it monitoring off to something in the internet, you're going to be monitoring your whole path to the internet without even monitor the path to the internet. Yeah, but then there's the mindset. What I find is the mindset. So a lot of customers that we do proof of values with, more proof of concepts with, some of them are open arms up front going, oh, this is the greatest thing ever, I've seen it. And they go through and they go, yeah, we can understand that, business case positive, off we go. Others start off with the arms crossed, sort of, I don't believe this is going to find anything, and we're not going to really get any quick value out of it, which I can tell you pretty much once you set some tests up, you find issues in majority of environments. There's only been a handful I haven't. We're very neat, clean, well-documented environments, typically with a lot of people running those environments, and that's probably, some of those environments that, an outage costs a lot of money, so they actually invest in it. But then there's the mindset as well, with people, the proactive versus reactive mindset.
Right.
Is that, if you got a reactive mindset, you get a lot of kudos in our world. So, hey, Fred's sitting there doing nothing all day, the network broke, because Fred hasn't been maintaining the network, for example. Then everyone goes, oh, Fred, can you help us? And Fred runs over there, reboots the router, the whole network comes good. Oh, Fred did the best thing ever. We'll send him a reward, and off you go. You get pats on the back. If you're proactive, you were running that network, no one even know you existed, and that mindset. So that's probably a business reward mindset. Like, in a way, the proactive side probably comes down to meeting SLAs or exceeding SLAs. You should get a pat on the back for every month that, you exceeded your SLAs. But I don't think many people do. If you don't meet them, then you probably get a slap. Whereas I think sometimes there should be less pats on the back when issues are fixed that's been reactive, where they shouldn't have even happened. And I think that's
right. Okay.
The hard thing. That's probably a bit controversial because it does upset some people when I say that. So, you've got to pick and choose when you say that in a meeting. I say that because you've got a closed mind. Like, you never know. So,
do you think part of that comes down to the fact that, like you mentioned earlier, right? If I go home, I'm now connected to a network which is completely out of my control. And therefore, I perceive I need the value of this. And then I perceive that when I'm in office, I have crafted my network in such a beautiful way that surely nothing should go wrong.
Yeah.
Is that more like, do you see a lot of that sort of mindset where...
Look, the things you see, so reliability should be higher in the office, right, because of the way those environments are crafted. Not all are. Like, we've dealt with some environments probably closer to the retail end of town where it is, where the profitability is low, so therefore the expenditure on technology is low. So therefore, they have a single router, maybe all in one box. It breaks and it's like, oh, we can't get one shipped for 3 days. That retail store's down. You do see that side, but they don't really care because there's 2 other retail stores within 10 k's drive. Problem solved. They don't. That's kind of the business way of thinking of it, is that I've got redundancy. They're called different stores. Whereas at home, typically the user experience is better than at work, because at work there's all these security gateways, all that kind of squashing my traffic down. An average company probably has maybe a 200 meg or a gig link out of their office, where at home, if you're on NBN fiber or something like that, you've got a gig to yourself, up, down, not up. Your contention's lower. Depending on your service provider upstream, that kind of stuff. So, your user experience, what I find, is usually better at home because there's less gateways and, inspections, and especially SSL inspection to go through. I shouldn't say that, anti-security.
But of course, that comes at the cost of security, right?
Well, it's kind of coming back now too, because, with a lot of that cloud scale, security, SSE, that kind of stuff, is that now, me sitting at home, not on a VPN, if it's something that should be inspected, it gets tunneled up to a cloud somewhere, to a POP. I've added the bottleneck again. They're better scaled now than what they were years ago, but there's still that sort of thing. I've really answered your question.
It makes
so many ways you have,
Yeah. Very good. So I guess we've covered then, obviously, monitoring from home, the need to monitor from office, and I guess the fallacy of thinking that the office is potentially more stable. Now, we covered different types of monitoring in terms of, endpoint agents, and then, for example, maybe more enterprise agents, right? Something where you store something on a switch or a Raspberry Pi in a network, and you're doing synthetic testing. That way you've got, I guess, the purview of what does my end user's experience look like, but what does perhaps the office experience look like? What is the problem? It helps you nail it down right. When we come to sort of active and then passive monitoring, I guess, what are the big differences? Like, for example, ThousandEyes as a product would be active, I guess you could say, whereas something on like a Meraki MX firewall, you've got passive monitoring, which is looking at past data, I guess.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So passive monitoring is more, like polling and that kind of stuff. So S&P data, NetFlow data, that kind of stuff. It's already happened. I've got a cool amount of data from that. But it doesn't. Like I could have S&P traps coming into me saying interfaces are down, links are 100% congested, or even S&P data telling me that. NetFlow is telling you that the interface is, overflowing, all that kind of stuff. Yet the user experience could be quite good, because if you've got a really good QoS policy and that kind of stuff. And that's where active monitoring is different, because the passive monitoring will typically, if I use those S&P, NetFlow, ping, that kind of stuff, traceroute, manual traceroute, it's here and now, or historical. Whereas active monitoring is pretending to be a user accessing the application, or pretending to be a system hitting another system inside there. So therefore, you can then correlate that properly back to the user's digital experience. Now, we're changing a bit here too, because the platform that I work on is that we're bringing that passive data into our active data as well, so we can time correlate across them. Hey, I saw a blip in loss of, or increase in response time to this application. In the past, we just go, well, that's an increase in response on application issue. Not my problem, go away. Whereas now we're starting to pull in, all that other passive data, so S&P data, flow data, IPFix, NetFlow. And so you can say, hey, I can see that dip, and I can also at the same time see, what application dipped at the same time. So start to correlate that across there, including, digging into the clouds. I'm not trying to do a sales pitch here, but into what's happening inside things like AWS and Azure, or Azure, whatever you want to call it this week. For looking inside them, every customer calls it something different and corrects me, so I just use both terms. Yeah, Microsoft. So, starting to sort of dig into there, to bring in the passive data from those into active monitoring as well, because that's quite important for correlating issues.
Fascinating.
Makes sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
Cool.
No, yeah, it's circling back on this one, and really, it's interesting that Scotty's mentioned that really depends on the investment of the company. Like, are we seeing changes in the way businesses have structured themselves to take into account things like, we back in the day, chief technology officer was the only guy who's pretty much handling the technology side of the house, and then it spawned out different roles like the CIO, the chief information security officer, and now more recently we're starting to see things like chief experience monitor, or did I get that concept right? Yeah. How are you seeing things change in terms of businesses?
Yeah, I think again that's that maturity thing. What we see, when organisations have that proactive mindset, or someone up top has that view, is the first thing you see pop out is proper operations centres and optimisation processes and things like that. Now, to do optimisation and that kind of stuff, you have to care about the user experience, and you have to use that data for good, rather than just for blaming people. So, even though it's fun, blaming people. So we are starting to see that in some customers, depending on where they are on that. I think that maturity cycle, like where, especially like probably finance sector and that kind of stuff. Large corporations is where we start to see that. Where they really do care about, especially anything that's got a customer, because customers straight away relate to profit. So not to be quite dirty, whereas employees, it's like, well, it depends on, what the issue is. Everyone can't work. I've got issues, but that's typically not, hopefully not the problem in there. So we're starting to see that those operations centers starting to come out, people starting to truly have, operational measures or SLAs or KPIs or something against that. And I guess that comes back to those sort of roles where they start to care about how do I track this and measure it. And you can only measure it with some sort of digital experience monitoring platform.
Okay. So does that mean that I've learned this concept ages ago that, for you to be able to improve on something, you first have to be able to quantify or measure something.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. So what are some of the more probably common measurements that they use? Like I know for a fact that response times probably would be a good measure, but at that level, does it really matter to them at all?
Yeah. So again, like it depends. So you can do simple things like lost latency, jitter, but that's a network measurement. And they may have an impact. All they're going to be really used for is prove the network innocence. Then above that is the application layer. Your completion times, transaction times, and then inside what we call a transaction. So a transaction test type of thing is when I actually really emulate a user. I log on to a platform. I go through that wonderful single sign-on thing. I'm a fan of single sign-on. Redirect 8 times, then you log in, and then you go and pick some stock out of a warehouse or do a retail transaction or check my bank balance on my bank account or check, something on an ISP's website or something like that, then you log out, disconnect, you follow that journey and you do that journey constantly over and over again. And you measure every single hop inside there and you take screenshots when there's errors as well. So that you can then go, how's that tracking inside there? What's my user logon experience? Oh, look, we've updated our, single sign-on policy. It only redirects 22 times now rather than 40 times. Has that had an impact on my login times? There's one customer I did some work with, and that you won't be identifiable from this, but their log-on time to the application was 12 seconds. So 12 seconds from when I hit enter after username and password, and it wasn't even single sign before before the user was presented that. No caching. The caching was turned off in that browser for that transaction. So that was a user experience every time I logged in. And 15-minute timeouts. So that was their user experience every time that they went to use that application was like, and everyone was complaining, going, yeah, but when you're in there, it's super fast. It's like, yeah, but the log-on time is this. If you had browser caching enabled for that component, it'd be great. So you're only going to pick that up with that kind of testing. So tracking all those and then relating them back to the user experience. Like the user experience is quite subjective. I guess we're just putting some metrics or collecting data, and that gives you metrics to actually measure. Because if you could have an application, you ask 10 different people. 8 of them might go, it's fine, and 2 go, no, it's rubbish. It's like, oh, okay, 80%'s good.
But you ask anyone nowadays, 10 seconds is an eternity.
Yeah, well, and people get tolerant too, and they stop complaining as well. That's one thing that we notice is they go, it's just always slow here, So no bother, no, I don't need to report it, So that happens a lot too. So how do you measure that? You need to be able to measure that. Back to what you're saying, we need to be able to weigh it. Sort of thing.
Yeah. And so I guess we're kind of winding down towards the last parts of this episode, and the question that really we want to kind of sum up in this whole past half hour of conversation is that and you kind of described that succinctly in so many words, but if you were to summarize that whole thought in probably one sentence, why do you think that people or technology users or people in general should care about digital experience monitoring, and why should they at least know about digital experience?
Ooh, that's a hard question. How do I do it in one sentence? That's great.
Or maybe 2.
Yeah. Well, I guess I almost open with that, like, you're spending all this money on infrastructure, and do you really need to? Like, the user experience is king on using anything. So if you're not measuring it, you don't care. It's that simple, inside there, that's probably the sentence I was going to expand, but I won't because you wanted to be succinct.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Employee productivity. If I'm not working, I'm not making the business money, right? And if I'm not working because of problems accessing some bit of technology, well, yeah.
Well, you just don't use it. Like, you know, example is a tool that we use internally that changed from one platform to another one. Now it's unusable, so I just don't use it. You know, oh, sorry, it's not part of my job anymore.
It's the
Someone else's
it's the
problem.
same thought, right? With the CRM software that we're using here internally in the company that we work at. When people complain about, hey, this CRM software is not working, or I'm having trouble logging in, they kind of take it as an unofficial day off or something.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Cool. Well, we've hit time on this episode for today. Thank you again for your time for this, Scotty. I think we really understand why we should care about it. So if we get any follow-ups, we'll definitely pass them through to you. But yeah, once again, thanks again for your time.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. And to our listeners, please stay tuned. There's a part 2 of this that is following up after this episode, and we're still staying with Scotty. It's going to be more interesting stuff, so keep an eye out for that.